Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Shoaib, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. John Tazaman and his team kindly invited me down to speak about some of the things that I'm looking into. Most of my research is in the field of Islam and science, and I will just like to mention that today's topic I feel might be a little bit of a sensitive one, given that evolution is sensitive amongst Muslim spaces. At some institutions that I've worked with, I know some places where people have been fired and deported from the country for speaking about evolution. So just to add a caveat from the get-go, I've been up since 4 a.m., so if I stammer or if I stutter, I apologize. And generally, just to feel very sorry for the translators, I'm a Punjabi and I speak really fast. But Muslims believe in miracles, so let's see how this goes, right? What I'd like to do is to walk through a historical journey with you, and it involves looking at the life of Charles Darwin. I personally, when I first started looking into evolution, I was very critical of the person, as well as critical of the idea of evolution. I found it very offensive, both as a Muslim, as well as just a human being. And through my own journey, I realized there's a lot more to the man than I initially thought. And I'd like to share some of those findings with you today. So just to give you an overview, I want to give you some context with respect to how I came to looking at Islam and evolution. That's generally been my area of study for the past 7 years. And then we'll look into how Muslims have responded to Charles Darwin. Once we do that, we'll then go over the history of Charles Darwin with a final concluding point, and I'll be happy to take on your questions. Some of you may know this work or not. In 2021, I published this book with Routledge called Islam and Evolution, Al-Ghazali and the Modern Evolutionary Paradigm. I took on a theological analysis of the theory of evolution as according to the modern day understanding of it. And I argue that there's a lot of space for Muslims when it comes to the theory of evolution. It does not have to be such a difficult thing to talk about. However, today we're not looking at theology. Just to make sure that I don't get deported the next second, we're going to be looking at the history. And specifically, Charles Darwin. Muslims have understood Charles Darwin very negatively in most of the literature that I've read. And this includes Arabic, Urdu, as well as English. Unfortunately, I cannot speak Turkish. Perhaps someday soon, inshallah, right? And he has been called a variety of things. He's been called an atheist, he's been called a nihilist, a Marxist, a communist, and on and on and on. The particular evaluation that I want to go over with you today is whether Charles Darwin himself was an atheist or not. And the reason why I want to analyze that specific proposition is because we have two different streams making those claims. On the one hand, we have some Muslims who say that Charles Darwin was an atheist, and he propped this theory up to undermine religious belief. That's one kind of argument. And then on the other hand, we have people like Richard Dawkins, who are very aggressive towards religion and want to undermine religion through the theory of evolution. So that's why I want to look at whether he himself was an atheist or not. And for me, and I hope it does for you too as well, it was shocking to find out what kind of man he was. That's what I found out. But where do these ideas come from? Who says that Darwin was an atheist, etc.? There are many names that I can put on the screen in front of you, but I'll put one that I think all of you will recognize. So this is a set of books, which I think most of you should be familiar with. And given that he himself is from here, right? And that is the infamous Harun Yahya, Adnan Oktar, right? I'm sure some of you know that he is behind bars at the moment for a lot of scandals that he was involved with. But in the recent decades, in the past 2-3 decades, I believe Harun Yahya, or Adnan Oktar, is largely responsible for refueling the antagonism shown towards Charles Darwin as well as the theory of evolution. And he made a lot of inaccurate statements in his works, because I read them. I had to read actually all of these works painstakingly. And I realized that he did make a lot of mistakes here and there. So they're beautiful books, by the way. You know, they're very, very flashy and everything, but painful nonetheless. So, all right. Now, this is a historical timeline of Charles Darwin's life. And there's a lot of information on here, but I just wanted to give you some of the main moments, right? So he was born in 1809, right there. He wrote The Origins of Species there about 1859, and he passed away in 1882. The rest of the details that you see here, we will slowly go through them. This is the simplistic timeline that I'd like you to follow through with me. The timeline presented here is based on the analysis of several historians, but the primary reference that I'll be using to walk you through this journey is Nick Spencer. In 2006, he published a book called God and Darwin. And in my opinion, it's one of the most beautiful biographies written of Charles Darwin. And it really makes you think of the kind of challenges and struggles that he was going through as an individual. So, let's start with the Christian phase, from 1809 to 1836. He was born into a generally wealthy Christian family. Most of his family members were practicing. So he had a relative, good understanding of the Christian faith. We won't get too bogged down in the details, and I want to go straight into his educational career. He was accepted at the University of Edinburgh in 1825. For those of you unaware, Edinburgh today is what is known as a Russell Group University. So we have an Ivy League concept in the US. These are like the top tier universities in the US. The equivalent of that in the UK is the Russell Group. Edinburgh is one of them. So it's a prestigious university and the top one in Scotland. Now he didn't enjoy that degree. He did very badly in the degree. So he left. So this is one of the biggest scientists who we look up to today, and he left a medical degree. Interestingly, when he left, you would think that he'd go on, maybe become a businessman or do something else, but he went on to the University of Cambridge to becoming a priest. So in Islamic lingo, after not doing well in medical studies, he went on to become an imam. That's the equivalent of what he's doing here. And this, he started in 1827. It is during this time at the University of Cambridge that he came across the works of William Paley. William Paley significantly influenced Charles Darwin and also impressioned his understanding of Christianity. And there's a lot we can say about William Paley, but William Paley is one of those individuals that Alper was talking about earlier, in that William Paley used a lot of scientific evidences of the day to show and prove God's hand in the universe. So there's a very famous analogy. If you find a clock in the middle of the desert, and you look at that clock, there's no way this thing is going to come about by chance. It has very intricate machinery, very sophisticated machinery. Of course, there must be a designer. And he talks about all kinds of things in effect to that in a lot of his works. And so Charles Darwin was impressioned by William Paley, and he had this understanding the universe was very organized, it was very principled, and it had a very law-like order to it, right? This is where he gets that understanding from. And he writes in his autobiography, which we'll come to later on, but he writes this at a later stage in time. He says, considering how fiercely I've been attacked by the Orthodox, so Orthodox Christians, it seems ludicrous that I once intended to be a clergyman. So when he reflects back on this phase of his life, he couldn't believe it that he was actually on a way to becoming a clergyman. So he finishes the degree, he finishes his undergraduate degree, in 1831. He then goes on to the famous Beagle Voyage. And in these 5 years, he goes across the world to study people, geographies, and landscapes. This is his journey over those 5 years. One is where he starts off in a city called Plymouth, and then he goes all the way down to South America, right here. And then he goes across the world. So this is not time travel. It just connects there, right? So he's going from there to there, all the way towards the oceanic territory, down below Africa, and then finally up back to the UK. The famous Galapagos Islands, where he discovers those finches. Actually, let me ask, can anyone guess which number that is? Where is the Galapagos Island? Who said that? Who said that? Well done, very good, 10. Give him a round of applause, guys, very good, mashallah, very good, excellent, really good. 10, right. That's where the Galapagos Islands are. That's where he discovers those finches. Now, during this period, he picks up a lot of ideas. He begins to see other civilizations, right? And civilizations that are not as civil as the European standard. He experiences a lot of natural disasters. He was once in an earthquake. He experienced an earthquake. And he notes in his autobiography how those things shook him up a little bit, in the sense that he saw the world more than what England was, right? Now we come to the phase where he comes back after this 5-year voyage, right? He's experienced, he's now seen the world, he's collected samples, and he's now, at this point in time, beginning to think of the theory of evolution. He thinks he has some kind of narrative. It's not robust, it's not strong, just the seeds of these ideas are formulating in his head. Most historians looking into Charles Darwin believe it is during this phase, 1836 to 1851, where the idea becomes solidified, and he's only rushed to publication because of a certain event that we will look into shortly. But it is this phase where the theory of evolution really comes into fruition. Now, I want to give you a human side to Charles Darwin. Just like coming from a Pakistani family, once you are 30s, you are pressured to get married. As soon as Charles Darwin came back, he was around late 20s, if I'm not mistaken, early 30s, and he had the idea of marriage in his mind. So believe it or not, what you see here is a table of the pros and cons of getting married or not married. So his ideas of what it means to be married is listed on the left-hand side, right here, and not to marry is there. So, and he's not doing this in any clear, systematic way. He's just writing the advantages of getting married and the disadvantages of getting married. Funnily enough, let me just, put your attention to this. If you do get married, you have a constant companion and friend in old age who will feel interested in one, object to be beloved and played with. Better than a dog anyhow. Right? So, and if you don't get married, imagine living all one's day solitary in a smoky, dirty London house. Only picture to yourself a nice, soft wife on a sofa with good fire and books and music rafts, right? And so, if you look at the not marrying part, right? This is funny because this is me in most cases. Cannot read in the evenings. He used to read a lot. He used to work a lot as a workaholic. He had these considerations in mind. But this is just to show you that there was a human side to Charles Darwin, that he was experiencing the day-to-day affairs, life struggles, like everybody else. Now, during this phase, several doubts started creeping his mind. Now, I'm not going to go through where he was or what phase of his career was in, but just during this phase, 1836 to 1851, a few challenges started creeping across. And he was trying hard to engage with them. So the first kind of challenge that he was looking at are scriptural challenges. As a Christian, he was committed to the Bible. But then he realized that there were certain things in the Bible that just didn't quite add up, right? So if you look here, and I'm not going to go through the entire quote sometimes, I'm just highlighting the main points. Many important details, far too important to be admitted as the usual inaccuracies of eyewitness. So a lot of the biblical events that we hear about just really don't add up. They don't make sense. So that was one kind of thing that he was experiencing. Another thing that he was experiencing are moral objections. So this is now, traditional Christian creed. And I think this is worth reading from beginning to end. He says, Scripture was no more to be trusted than the sacred books of the Hindus or the beliefs of any barbarian. The plain language of the text seems to show that the men who do not believe, and this would include my father, brother, and almost all my best friends, will be everlastingly punished. And this is a damnable doctrine. So he's having doubts. This religion has pretty harsh outcomes. Is this something that I really believe in? Right? He was also having, wider philosophical issues. As a scientist, when you explore the world, when you try to understand reality around you, you may, be impressioned by a certain regularity such that it becomes fixed in your mind. Charles Darwin says, the clearest evidence which would be requisite to make any sane man believe in the miracles by which Christianity is supported. The more we know of the fixed laws of nature, the more incredible do miracles become. So he also begins to now doubt the existence of miracles or the happenstance of miracles. Those are another thing that he was trained about in Christianity. The biggest thing, in my opinion, though, the biggest thing that he encountered, and this is going to come up again and again, is the problem of evil and suffering. I stated earlier that Charles Darwin, when he came back from the Beagle voyage, he started really thinking about what created this entire biodiversity. And that is where he started thinking about common ancestry and the mechanism of natural selection. But he understood that there were specific entailments if this theory was true. If there is a God, why would he create such a cruel process through which several species, entities, die? He says here, for example, what war between insect and insect, between insects, snails, and other animals with birds and beasts of prey, all striving to increase and all feeding on each other, on the trees or their seeds and seedlings, or on the other plants which first clothe the ground and thus check the growth of the trees. So he's talking about competition. The earth does not have an infinite number of resources. In each environment and landscape, there's a given number of prey, there's a given number of things that you can eat, and you have predators around you all the time. And you have competitors as well. And this seems like such a harsh landscape to work with. It is why he eventually said, what a book a devil's chaplain might write on the clumsy, wasteful, blundering low, and hardly cruel works of nature. He felt that the entire process, if his theory was true, would lead to a lot of moral difficulties to digest. So that was one dimension. It was the entailment of the theory of evolution. But there's another dimension to this as well. Hands up if you're parents. Hands up if you're parents. So we've got a few parents in here. Some of you are not, right? Try to think that you're parents. All right, so we've got a few parents. Okay, great. There's a lag phase between the translation, right? So this was a very important moment in Charles Darwin's life. Charles Darwin had many kids, right? I think he had 8 kids, 2 of which died. The one that he loved the most out of those 8 was a little girl called Anne, or he referred to her as Annie. Now, this girl, she was just 10. It seemed like, based on the descriptions that he writes about in his autobiography, that she had tuberculosis. It's not sure yet, but this is one speculation. But she had a very, very bad disease. In the final 3 weeks of the disease, things got for a worse turn. She started coughing, vomiting really badly. And so he was with her day and night. At this time, his wife was pregnant, and at least as far as I can make it, she wasn't with Anne during that period. And Anne suffered quite a violent death, right? Except that last night where she died peacefully. Now, when I read this as a teenager, this didn't really affect me much. I'm now a father of a 6-year-old, and I can't imagine my life without my son. More than that, I had a sister who would have been older than me. Her name was Sundus. For those of you unaware, Sundus is the name of silk garments for those who get to go to heaven, right? That was the name my mom and dad gave her. She passed away when she was 6 months old. And my mom had a shock. So then I came afterwards, and that's why my mom sometimes dressed me up as a girl to fulfill her wishes that she had a daughter. My dad also had it rough, right? He had it rough, but he didn't talk about it much. Then recently, my grandmother, my dad's mother, passed away. And then I asked him, what do you feel? Right? What did you feel? And he said something that stuck with me. He said, lucky are those parents who get buried by their children, not who bury their children. And that really stuck with me. And so when I read this as a father, I really feel the pain. I can kind of sense what he's going through here. And so Charles Darwin was really sensitive to suffering and the problem of evil. And that really resonated through his entire life. 1951 was a key moment where you now see him fluctuating in his thoughts from Christianity towards deism, towards agnosticism, which is why we get to the final stage. Now, in 1858, Charles Darwin was pretty much set on his idea of evolution, but he had no intention of publishing it. The prompt to publish his ideas only came when the chap on the right-hand side sent him a manuscript. So that's Alfred Wallace. Alfred Wallace is actually the co-founder of the theory of evolution with Charles Darwin, but he's usually buried in a footnote and is forgotten in history in most courses that I've seen on evolution. And I mean, who he was and what he did is not really important, but the idea here is that he independently came up with the idea of evolution, and given that Charles Darwin was well connected, he sent a manuscript of his ideas. And Charles Darwin was alarmed. Wow, this guy literally has the same idea as me. And so they co-published a short piece together. This prompted Charles Darwin to write his full manuscript, which is known as the Origin of Species. This came out in 1859, the following year. So he really rushed to getting his ideas out there. Now, the Origin of Species is a very interesting book. It goes through the various kinds of inferences that he's using to, one, argue that there is something called a tree of life, and two, the mechanism through which evolution occurs, natural selection. And when you look into the language and the style and the way he's writing, Charles Darwin is actually a very delicate writer. He thinks about each word when he pens it down. Interestingly, at the end of the Origin of Species, and this went through 6 editions, this is just the first edition we're talking about, he writes this: "To my mind, it accords better with what we know of the laws impressed on matter by the Creator, that the production and extinction of the past and present inhabitants of the world should have been due to secondary causes, like those determining the birth and death of the individual." Now, scholars disagree. Why did he write this in the Origins? Was it to appease, the religious folks out there? Or did he actually believe in this? And because, human beings are complex creatures, it's not always to reach a definitive solution on someone's ideas. But what's clear here is that he definitely wanted to convey that evolution did not have an intrinsic atheistness to it. That's clear from this paragraph. Now, the reception of evolution was mixed. right? You will see people arguing against evolution. You will see people arguing for. And I just wanted to share two quotes from two different thinkers. This is by Reverend Henry Baker Tristram. To him, the theory of evolution didn't really impact the Christian faith. So if you read here, every peculiarity of difference in the living inhabitants of each country is admirably adapted by the wisdom of their beneficent creator for the support and preservation of species. So he's like, okay, evolution is true, so what? Right? But then you have negative reactions. Professor Adam Sedgwick was Charles Darwin's teacher. And Sedgwick believed that Charles Darwin's theory was very disgusting. It really kind of blurred the lines between the metaphysical and the physical, and it was an abomination for human dignity. So he really didn't like the theory of evolution at all. And we can go through various kinds of reasons why people accepted or rejected the theory of evolution, but this is just to give you a flavor that this was a mixed reception. Another thing that I wanted to highlight during this phase was that Charles Darwin really did think about the idea of whether evolution undermined design or not. Remember earlier I talked about William Paley, how each thing is created by God with a sufficient amount of complexity such that you infer a designer? Well, the theory of evolution, to him at least, undermined that thesis. The person on the right-hand side is Asa Gray. He was an American botanist, and he actually popularized the theory of evolution, Darwin's idea, in the States. But he did not believe that evolution undermined design. Here's what they say. Asa Gray believes that the Darwinian theory implies that the birth and development of species are as natural as those of an individual. So let me rephrase that. William Paley said, something is so complex in one entity, one biological entity, such that it infers a designer. But Asa Gray says, well, if we now have a process, that process is still there. It's still leading to design. So what's the big problem? This was Asa Gray, right, in the late 19th century. Now, Charles Darwin had a different take on this. Here's what he says. With respect to the theological view of the question, this is always painful to me, and I highlighted that for a reason. I am bewildered. I had no intention to write atheistically. I cannot see as plainly as others do, and as I should wish to do, evidence of design and beneficence on all sides of us. There seems to be too much misery in this world. So as stated earlier, the problem of evil really sticks with him. He's struggling to get through this idea in light of his theory. He also struggled with, trying to understand generally proofs for God's existence, given evolution. If human beings are just, very advanced apes, so to speak, and I'm sorry in advance if that offends anyone, I'm just, regurgitating what Darwin believes. And here, he's trying to get through the idea, if we're just products of evolution, and we're all, created through forces of natural selection, and just fierce struggle, why would the conviction of a human being be any different to an apes, an advanced monkeys, right? And if you see here, this is what he highlights. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? And this leads to him thinking about God's existence. Look at the second paragraph. The strongest argument for the existence of God is instinct or intuition, that there must have been an intelligent beginner of the universe. So you see here, he does feel that there's an intuitive pull, that there's a designer being called out. However, something stops him from going that far. What does he say? But then comes the doubt and difficulty whether such intuitions are trustworthy. So again, you see a man who is struggling with his faith. Most importantly, and this is the main conclusion that I want to draw. I said at the beginning of this lecture that we have two kinds of people. Aggressive atheists, like Richard Dawkins, who want to hijack Charles Darwin, and some Muslims who are misinformed about Charles Darwin and use him to prop up an anti-evolutionary rhetoric. To be pro-evolutionist or being, against evolution is an entirely different conversation to what Charles Darwin himself believed. In these 2 paragraphs, he made his stance quite clear, at least to me. The safest conclusion seems to be that the whole subject is beyond the scope of man's intellect. I am forced to leave the problem insoluble. I think that generally, but not always, that an agnostic would be the most correct description of my state of mind. In another paragraph, he says, I cannot pretend to throw the least light on such abstruse problems. The mystery of the beginning of all things is insoluble by us, and I, for one, must be content to remain an agnostic. He makes that crystal clear and in his own work. Now, we have people like Richard Dawkins, who maintain that evolution equals to atheism. It is my contention that Charles Darwin, if he were alive today, he would say, oh, really? I think he would be more cautious. Charles Darwin would not condone the kind of aggressive, militant rhetoric that people like Richard Dawkins has used to undermine religious belief. In fact, and if you recall what I said earlier, Charles Darwin started thinking about evolution in the 1930s, but he didn't publish his ideas until 1959. And that's because he was aware of the kind of religious uproar it could bring about. So he was very cautious. He was a very careful thinker. And so I believe that this is a lesson to take from Charles Darwin at the very least, in the sense that when people use his ideas or even misrepresent him, that is a false presentation being brought forth. Finally, this is the last photo of Charles Darwin before his death. Right? This is the last photo of him before his death. When I see that photo, personally speaking, I don't see, somebody who's cheering over his success of discovering evolution. I see somebody who is generally struggling in trying to answer life's biggest questions. And I'll leave it there. And I just wanted to give you a few references in case you wanted to read up on this issue. The first book on the left-hand side is the book by Nick Spencer. It's a biography, and so is that, The Reluctant Mr. Darwin. Fern, she's a professor at University of Birmingham. She wrote this book called The Selfish Genius, How Richard Dawkins Rewrote Darwin's Legacy. She discusses in that book how people like Dawkins have completely misrepresented Darwin in the imaginary space today. Asa Gray's work have been compiled by Hunter Dupree in this work. And this book is very new. It's written by a friend of mine. He's a Finnish scholar. He talks about how evolution and design are not in conflict. I would say he's the latest version of Asa Gray today. To conclude, there have been many misconceptions about Charles Darwin, and I wanted to convey that he was a man going through human experiences who struggle with faith. Now, you may disagree with him and agree with him. That's a different conversation altogether. But I do believe that correctly representing him is important. What I take as a personal lesson from Charles Darwin is epistemic humility. He wasn't someone who was trying to force this idea down anyone's throat. He offered suggestions. Even when it came to publishing The Origin of Species, towards the end of the book, the last 3 chapters, he talks about how you can undermine his theory. He gives falsification checks. So if he says, if the Earth is X, Y years old, it needs to be much older for the theory of evolution to be true. If the Earth is not older, my theory would be falsified. Right? So he provides those details. So that's why I believe this is an important lesson to take. Thank you so much for listening to me. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Malik, for the great talk. Any questions from the audience? Bir iki tane kısa soru alalım.
Am I supposed to wear something?
Mikrofon, Ahmed.
Oh, right, okay. I'll be here for this.
Thank you very much.
Just a second. Just, okay. So, yeah, go ahead, yeah.
Thank you very much. Just a second. 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 We know that the origin of the species is the most prominent work that Charles Darwin authored. But as far as his professions, as far as his admissions to agnosticism, which works are the main ones referenced?
Right. So that's an awesome question. So he published several books, Descent of Man. He even had a book on barnacles. But recently, what people have done is they've compiled all his correspondences with various other scholars. And it is through these correspondences that we get this side of Charles Darwin. So these are very, private letters sent to Asa Gray, sent to various scholars, etc., etc. And now you can actually, so if you read Nick Spencer's book, the book that I showed on the left, he actually puts up a website where you can see all of Charles Darwin's correspondences, and you can actually mine the data for yourself and see what interesting things you find. No worries.
Okay, thanks. Next question.
Merhaba, hoş geldiniz.
Okay, one second. Oh, yeah, hello. Okay, sorry. Hello.
Aslında söylemek istediklerim çok uzun ama kısaca ifade etmek ve bir soru sormak istiyorum. Aslında gerçeklik bir tane. Darwin'in yaptığı da bu gerçekliği tanımlamaya çalışmak. Ben bu noktada çok fazla takıldığımızı düşünüyorum. Bilim, bilgi yoluyla bu gerçekliği tanımlamaya çalıştı. Felsefe, anlam arayışıyla buna bir anlam vermeye çalıştı. Din de anlamlandırarak bu bir üst versiyona geçti veya geçmesi gerekiyordu. Biz bu ateizme çok takıldığımızı düşünüyorum. Yani panteizmi ele alarak, hatta panenteizmi de geçerek biz Müslümanlar olarak, buradaki Müslümanı sadece Muhammed Peygamber'e iman edenler olarak alıyorum. Bunun da üzerinde bir teoloji geliştirerek, yani Allah'a ulaşmamız bizim için çok daha kolay. Ve bunu hakkıyla başaramadığımızı düşünüyorum. Yani La ilahe illallah'ın La ilaheyi bile tam anlamıyla söyleyemediğimizi düşünüyorum. Bu noktada bu Darwin'in bu gerçekliği tanımlamasıyla bize nasıl bir ışık tutabilir? Bize nasıl yardımcı olabilir?
Okay, so, all right, okay, bismillah. Right, so if I understood you correctly, and please tell me if I didn't, you're asking me that Muslims have their own worldview, and they have a commitment to La ilaha illallah, a full submission to God. And given that, how can we as Muslims benefit from Charles Darwin's ideas? Is that it?
Yeah, more or less, yeah.
Yeah? Just give me a thumbs up if that works. Yes. Yes, great. Okay. So this particular presentation was not about whether we can accept evolution or not. I've done that in other places. I don't want to do that today. All I'm trying to show is that I think there's a level of humanity that is missed out when certain Muslim scholars write about Charles Darwin. When I read Harun Yahya's work, and maybe it would have been good to provide some quotes from him, but he writes, in very negative terms. He says that Charles Darwin was a pagan. He was influenced by Greeks, and he created the theory of evolution to undermine religious belief when he never in fact did that. Without naming certain individuals, so this is now in the Arab world, I've had quotes from well-known scholars who say that Darwin was a Jewish Zionist, and he did this to create a kind of a worldview through Israel that can then hopefully take over the Middle East, stuff like that, when none of that is in fact true. My only intention today was to show that on his own terms and on his own merit, he was a very careful thinker, and I think being careful and being specific with your ideas has a lesson for everyone. In his own work, as I mentioned, he talks about, this is my theory, these are the ways you can falsify it. if you've been around scientists, and I spend most of my time with scientists, sometimes you get a lot of arrogance. No one writes like that today. And I think that is the lesson that I'm trying to take away from this. Of course, there is one truth. No one is denying that there's a truth. But I believe that there's more to the man than just being the evil guy who went out to undermine religion. I think there's more to him. I learned a lot from him. Because bear in mind that when I studied Charles Darwin, I came with all those negative things in my mind. Harun Yahya is available everywhere till today, in mosques, in schools, in seminaries, everywhere till today. And he had a huge impression on my outlook. And so for me to actually read him, I was conflicted. I'm like, what am I reading and what did I receive? And I just felt very humbled by that. I felt very humbled by him as a person. And I just wanted to share those experiences with you. God knows best.
Okay, thanks for the talk and all the. I think you have an announcement to make, right?
Is it time? Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, okay. So this is the end of the session. Oh, sorry. So this is the end of the session, but I just wanted to share something very important. And I want to thank the organizers for allowing me to do so. So I work in the field of science and religion, more specifically in the field of Islam and science. And unfortunately, there is not enough infrastructural development in this area. So if you look at the broader science and religion discourse, we have textbooks written from Christian angles, we have dedicated universities, departments, PhD programs, master programs, even academic positions on science or religion. I don't think the Muslim world has anything like that yet. However, two things have happened this year. One, the Cambridge University Press, they have started an Element series on Islam and science. So an Element series, for those of you unaware, these are short books, around 30,000 words, and they're hopefully meant to be summaries of what's out there at the moment. So that started. The other thing that's kicked off is, and I have now legal permission to make this public, is I will be the chief editor of the world's first monograph series dedicated to Islam and science with Palgrave. And this is the first time where in an academic space, at an international level, we can get works in this area where hopefully we'll see many, many developments. Islam and AI, organ transplantation, evolution, quantum mechanics, and what have you. And in addition to that, we are also accepting translations of key works from Turkish, Urdu, Arabic, and Farsi. So I just wanted to share that to spread the awareness. This will be made public in a few days. But yeah, you're privy to that information. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, please follow up with me.